All right, hello everyone and welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening. My name is Isabel Molina and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. We're very pleased to welcome you to today's book talk, For the Last Million, Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War, with author David Nasaw. After the presentation, there will be an audience Q&A, so please have your questions ready. Now, before we begin, I would like to ask that you please silence your cell phones and anything else you may have on you that might make noise during the lecture. But other than that, thank you so much and enjoy.
Thank you all for coming, and welcome to what I am told are the 250 people who were at home watching, but I'm delighted that you were here, so I have somebody to look at and talk to. The talk I'm going to give tonight is a talk about courage, resilience, renewal of the survivors of the Holocaust, and the near total indifference of the leaders of the world, of the nations of the world, including the United States. At war's end, Europe, Germany, Poland, the Baltic states were consumed by disruption, destruction, displacement, population transfers. 1 million refugees were left behind in Germany, housed in makeshift displaced persons camps, surrounded by barbed wire, in old army barracks, hotels, resorts, monasteries, and sometimes cordoned off towns. 1 million, the last million. The camps were administered by UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, and protected by armies of occupation. The first task of those armies of occupation was to delouse those who had come out of the camps, who had been freed. Who were the last million and why were they in Germany at war's end? There were Polish and Ukrainian forced laborers. Germany sent millions of men off to fight in the East and then in the West. And they needed individuals to work in the factories, to till the fields, to bring in the harvest. And how did they get them? Through coercion and kidnapping. The Polish and Ukrainian forced laborers or slave laborers were freed at the end of the war, and for reasons I will talk about, did not want to go home. They came into the camps from Poland, from Eastern Europe. This is a young displaced person, probably a Polish girl, showing a Nazi tattoo. One can read the faces of those who are looking at it. From Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania came hundreds of thousands. And why? Why? Because many of them had been collaborators with the Germans. And they knew that when the Red Army pushed the Germans out, they would be imprisoned or worse. So they fled with the help of the German army into Germany as the war came to an end. And then, disguised themselves and their pasts and sought refuge in the displaced persons camps. There were 20 to 30,000, we don't know how many Jewish survivors. Why? Because the Allies and the UN did not recognize Jews as Jews. If you were born in Latvia, you were a Latvian. If you were born in Poland, you were Polish. And when the armies of occupation took the 1 million refugees who were stuck in Germany and put them into displaced persons camps, they arranged them by nationality. So the Jewish Poles were put into camps with non-Jewish Poles. The Jewish Latvians with Latvian Christians, many of whom had been in their hometowns, some of whom had been guards in the camps. Dr. R.A. Tatakauer of the WJC, the World Jewish Council, wrote the Army general in charge of the camps to request, polite term, that the Jewish survivors not be placed in the same camp with Nazis or with other enemy nationals at whose hands only yesterday they suffered most cruelly. A large number of the Jews who were in Bergen-Belsen came out of the camps at Bergen-Belsen, and the authorities wanted to disperse them. And the survivors of Bergen-Belsen said, no, we want to remain together. But the Allies said, the Americans and the British in particular said, but we're worried about typhoid, we have to burn down the concentration camp. And the Jewish survivors knew that less than a mile away, there were the quarters that the Germans had occupied. The German officers, the guards, they refused to leave, and they trekked down as the Bergen-Belsen camp was burned down. They went to the quarters in the barracks where the Germans had spent the war. And the Allies again tried to change the name from Bergen-Belsen to something that did not ring of the horror and the terror that they had gone through. And the Jewish survivors said no. I'm going to walk. If I get out of the frame, you'll stop me. What I found most remarkable as I did this research was that no one in the United States or in England paid any attention to the Jews as Jews. Edward R. Murrow had a very famous, visited one of the camps. I don't remember if it was Dachau, and talked about what the Germans had done. And he talked about all the nationalities and the national groups that had been in that camp, but he did not mention Jews. Okay. The newspaper articles about the concentration camps did not mention Jews. The newsreels did not mention Jews. The liberation of Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Ohrdruf, Buchenwald was publicized, but not the fact of the Jewish survivors and the Jewish torture and the Jewish suffering and the Jewish deaths. The heroes in this story were the Jewish chaplains. The American army had chaplains of every faith who accompanied the soldiers and were supposed to hold services. When the war was over, the Jewish chaplains, one after the other, deserted. They said, "To hell with this. The soldiers don't need us. The survivors do." And they went into the camps, and there are these extraordinary stories I found and I tell in my book. There's a story of one Jewish chaplain who walks through the camps, and he tries to find, he's there in the beginning, and he tries to find the Jewish survivors who were all the way in the back of the camp. And he finds them. And in halting Yiddish, he says, "Can I help you?" And from their beds and their bunks, he hears yes. The problem was that many of these survivors, and this is a story well told, when the Americans try to feed them, they give them too much food on stomachs that had been depleted and emptied for years. And that leads to stomach problems and often to death. The Jewish chaplains were the only ones who reported back to their families, to their hometown newspapers, to their congregations, to their shuls, what was going on, of what they saw. And gradually there was an awareness, not from Edward R. Murrow and CBS and the New York Times, but from the chaplains spreading the word. There was one Jew in Truman, who is now Roosevelt, and Truman, who is now president. One Jew in the cabinet, Morgenthau. And Morgenthau, who had not, I don't know if he had ever gone to temple. He was not observant in any way. But when the news got to him, he went to Truman and he said, something has to be done. And Truman appointed a man named Harrison, who was, I believe, a Lutheran who had become an Episcopalian, to go to Germany and to find out what was happening with the Jewish survivors who had been taken out of the camps, out of the death camps and the concentration camps, and put into displaced persons camps. And Harrison arrived, and Harrison looked, visited with the help of a representative from the Jewish distribution, and he went to the camps and he reported back to Truman. The army had planned that they would bring people to him, but he said, no, I want to go to the camps. And he reported back to Truman, and Truman, who had just come back from the Potsdam conference, met with him. He read his report, and then he met with him. And Harrison, in his report, said, we are treating the Jews exactly the way the Germans did, behind barbed wire, but we're feeding them a little better. Truman was aghast. The British said that this was nonsense, this was ridiculous. Harrison said, we have to do something about the Jews. If the only place they want to go and will take them is Israel, then the British have to open up the gates of Palestine to let in the Jews. The British said, no, no, we will not, we cannot do this. So Truman, on his own, got in touch with Dwight Eisenhower. And he said to Eisenhower, I want to move the Jews into their own camps, the Jewish survivors. I don't want them intermixed with non-Jews. And I want extra supplies given them. And I want religious whatever religious materials they need given to them, and extra rations and extra clothing. And the American soldiers were told by Eisenhower to help resettle the Jewish survivors. And Eisenhower visits a synagogue in the fall of 1945. He's with George Patton, who is, I don't know how to describe the man, a horror, a terror. And Patton says to Eisenhower, why are you doing this? Why are these people getting special treatment? They're next to animals. But Eisenhower understands, and to show his solidarity with the Jews, he visits a synagogue on the High Holy Days. It's a remarkable gesture. And Eisenhower also understands that the only solution, he believes, is to get, and he says this to Truman, is to get the British to open the mandate so that the Jews can go to Palestine. And Truman does whatever he can. He implores Churchill and then Clement Attlee to open the gates to Palestine. And he continues to do so with the support of American Jewry and organizations, Jewish organizations, for the next several years. And guess what? Nothing happens. Because Truman doesn't go far enough. Truman could have said to the British, you need our loans to rebuild your economy, open the gates of Palestine. You need our support to rebuild and to keep your colonies, open the gates of Palestine. And the British said no. And then the British said, and Clement Attlee got in trouble for this, the British said, you just want to open Palestine because you don't want the Jews in the United States. A cruel but true statement. The Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Ukrainians, the Poles, and the Jews are settled in their own displaced persons camps, which become communities, nations in exile. The United Nations is supposed to watch over them, but it can't. It doesn't. What it does is it lets the displaced persons run the camps. And they try, each of these ethnic groups, each of these national groups try to keep alive their customs, their culture, their language, their literature, their games, their dances, their music. Because by now, every one of these groups lived in nations that had been taken over to some extent by the Soviets. So the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Poles, the Ukrainians attempt to keep some semblance of culture. This is Lithuanian kindergartners in traditional dress for national celebration. The Jewish camps at first are relatively small. The Germans had closed down the major death camps and concentration camps and work camps in Poland because they knew the Russians were on the way, and they knew they had created a crime against humanity that they did not want to be remembered for. So they bulldozed the camps, and the decision was made, why gas the Jews when we can work them to death? So the Jews who had been in the Polish camps were moved in cattle cars, in forced marches into Germany, where they were put to work underground in the munitions factories that Hitler hoped would produce special airplanes and bombs that would win the war in the end. And they didn't want Germans to work there because the conditions were such that you couldn't survive very long. But let the Jews work there. So they were all through Germany. There were these work camps that doubled as death camps. When the war was over, again, we don't know how many, but probably no more than 25 to 30,000 Jewish survivors were liberated from Dachau, Buchenwald, Ohrdruf, Bergen-Belsen, and they were moved into the DP camps. Thousands more, and again, we don't have the numbers. Thousands more. What was the first thing they did? If they could walk, the first thing they did was try to hitch a ride on military trucks or vehicles, or on trains, or begin the long walk home to see if anyone was alive. All through Poland, there were sometimes in post offices, sometimes in synagogues, sometimes in city halls, there were lists. You know, I am alive. I am alive. I can be found at so-and-so and so-and-so. But the number who had survived was tiny. And those who made the long treks back from Germany to Poland and Latvia and Lithuania found only death. Death. And they also found anti-Semitism stronger than had been before the war. Nazi anti-Semitism was a curse, a disease, and contagious. And the Poles said to the Jews, and this happened over and over again. I have the, from memoirs and oral histories, I have it in my book. A young woman would arrive at her former apartment house and walk up the stairs, knock on the door, and was told, "We thought you were dead. We live here now." The Polish Jews who survived, less than 400,000 out of a pre-war population of 3.25 million. And of those 400,000, more than half of them survived because they had crossed the border into the Soviet Union when the war began. And they did not have an easy time in the Soviet Union. But they survived. They survived in work camps. They survived, some of them in prisons. And when the war was over, Stalin, and historians haven't entirely figured out why, it wasn't simply anti-Semitism. In 1945, 1946, later Stalin would go crazy, would become a crazy, violent anti-Semite, but not in 45. He offered the Polish Jews transportation back to Poland. And again, 200,000 or more came back into Poland from the Soviet Union. They'd been away for 4 or 5 years. And what did they find? Violence, hatred. At Kilcha, in the spring of 1946, the violence against the Jews reached its ascended, and dozens, again, we don't know exactly how many, of Jews who had come back from the Soviet Union and were camped out in what had been a warehouse. There was no place else for them. There was a rumor, as rumors always go, that they had, I don't know, I'm not even going to go into it. The result was that Polish thugs, hooligans, burned down the warehouse and slaughtered, again, dozens of Polish Jews.
Where was this?
Kilcher pogrom. Here is a woman who mourns her husband at a public burial. And after Kilcher, the Polish Jews knew that if they were going to survive, they had survived the war. If they were going to survive the post-war, there was only one place where they would be safe. And here is the irony of ironies. What was that one place? Germany and Austria. Here is an assembly center in Salzburg where the recent arrivals from Poland await transportation into Germany or into one of the camps in Austria. The situation in the Jewish displaced persons camps changes dramatically in 1946 with the influx of 200,000 Polish Jews. And those Polish Jews came with children. The camps in the beginning had no children. The survivors of Dachau, Buchenwald, there were very few children. And now young families arrived, and young people arrived who had spent the war in the Soviet Union. And the camps ballooned in size from 30, 40, 50,000 to a total population of maybe 250,000 Jews. And there was, and this is what I meant in the beginning when I talked about courage, there was no room for sadness, for mourning, although they mourned. Everyone in the camps knew someone who had not survived, had family members, friends, parents, children, brothers, sisters. But they knew that they were the last remnant of the European Jews, of the Polish Jews. And they were not going to let Hitler and the Nazis win the battle of annihilation, of genocidal violence. It was their task to renew, revive, resurrect European Jewry and Judaism. And they did so. You know, when visitors went to the Jewish camps, they were shocked by the number of baby carriages. The number of babies born in the camps, including a lot of people that I've spoken to, and maybe people in the audience. It was sort of your duty to your heritage to have babies, right? And the camps were flooded with baby carriages. And the Jewish displaced persons did all they could to keep their heritage, their religion, their people alive. There were publishing houses, concert halls, poetry recitals, schools, one after the other. And there were visitors. One of the things that the Jews in the camps played sports, and they had boxing matches in the camps, and then the champions in each Jewish camp would fight in a tournament against the champions in other camps. They played football or soccer as well, but boxing. And they formed orchestras. Can anybody recognize who that is conducting the orchestra? Leonard Bernstein. He's conducting an orchestra of survivors, right? Of survivors and a handful of professional German musicians. And he performed concerts, the members of the Bavarian State Opera Orchestra at Feldafing in Landsberg in May of 1948. And guess who else visited? Ben-Gurion. And Ben-Gurion said to the survivors, in 1946, we will get you to Israel. We are with you. We are with you. There was a debate going on in Israel. A new nation, a proud nation. Do we want these people? Do we want these survivors? I mean, they're sick. They're European. They speak Yiddish, not Hebrew. Do we want them among us? They are not the vibrant, young people who are going to make this nation. And Ben-Gurion said, yes, we want them. We want every one of them. If we have to bring them on stretchers, we will bring them. If we have to build tuberculosis sanatoria, we will bring them. And he is telling the survivors here exactly that. The debate between the Bundists and the Zionists, as I'm sure everybody here knows, Jews are a disputatious species. And the debate that went on in the camps between the Bundists, who said, let's wait and we'll go back to Poland and we'll create, and the Zionists who said, come on. There is no survival for us in Poland or anywhere in Europe. We have to leave Europe. And the Zionists won that battle. And with the help of the Jewish Agency and with Israelis and with some Americans, they began to prepare for Aliyah to Israel. This is a group of young men, guaranteed that most of them had come from Poland. I'm sorry, had come from the Soviet, spent the war in the Soviet Union. Okay? And they are learning to work in the fields so that when they get to Palestine, Israel, they can, jump right in. The resettlement of the displaced persons begins in 1947 and 1948. Why? Because every nation that had participated in the war had a labor shortage. They had lost soldiers, and those who hadn't lost soldiers needed, like in Latin America, they needed laborers. And the UN said, come to the displaced persons camp. Pick out whoever you want. Bring them back to your home. Bring them back to your nation. Let them build Brazil, Argentina, South Africa. Rebuild France, Belgium, the United Kingdom. And it was like a cattle market. The displaced persons would line up and they would be interviewed by these representatives, these recruiters from nations that had been victorious in the war. And this one and this one and this one would be picked out and given visas. And guess who wasn't picked out? The Jews. It was assumed that they were too clannish. But more than that, those who had been in the camps were too injured, were too disabled to be the hearty workers that the Argentinians wanted and the Brazilians wanted and the South Africans wanted. There was some groups, like the Canadians, because there was a strong Canadian Jewish community, that they didn't say we want, 1,000 Jews. They said we want garment workers, okay? And we will take, I don't know what the number was, 500, 1,000 garment workers from the displaced persons camps. So former doctors, lawyers, learned to operate sewing machines so that they could be admitted to Canada and leave Germany behind. The Jews were not offered asylum or resettlement anywhere. But there was one place that would welcome them, they hoped, and that was Palestine, Israel. The British weren't going to welcome them, but the Jewish community there was going to welcome them. Here are two Jewish DPs walking in Marseille before their departure to Palestine aboard the Exodus, 1947. And here are parents at Bergen-Belsen saying goodbye to their son, who is leaving for Israel. In June of 1948, the Americans finally get around to passing a Displaced Persons Act. They are the last nation to accept any displaced persons of any ethnicity. So a Displaced Persons Act is passed in 1948, but guess what? It is passed in such a way that it is impossible for the Jews to take advantage of the visas. A coalition led by Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans puts into the Displaced Persons Act a clause, or a number of clauses. And those clauses say that the only people who will be given these visas, or the people who will be given preference for these visas, are agricultural workers and people from countries that had been taken over by the Soviet Union. Latvia, Ukraine, Lithuania, Estonia. 90% of the Jewish DPs are denied visas. The only place on earth that was willing to accept the Jews was Israel. But there was no Israel until May of 1948. And one of the reasons Truman supported partition first and then independence was that he knew that all the other displaced persons were leaving, were being resettled. And the only place to resettle the Jews was Palestine, because he couldn't get them into the United States, and because he couldn't get them into the United States, no other nation said, well, if the Americans aren't taking them, there must be a reason. We don't want them either. Let me end with a story. Eventually, about 150,000 of the Jewish DPs go to Israel. Many because they want to go. Others don't want to go. They don't want to go to a nation that's at war. They don't want to go to a nation. They've been in one war. But there's no place else for them to go. And about 50,000 come to the United States. 50,000. Justice would not be served by the Displaced Persons Act. Eventually it was amended, but too late. As I concluded my research, I met Itzhak and Lola Lachman in a nursing home Okay, I'm going to get to questions momentarily. I met Itzhak and Lola Lockman in a home. Itzhak was 99, his wife was 98. She had lost her memory, was in a wheelchair. He talked to me. And they had met at Dachau, and then they had been together at Feldafing, and they were married in Feldafing and had 3 children. And he had been through it all, both of them had. They marry, have children in the camps, then 2 more in Brooklyn. And he looks at me, 98 years old, 98, not 99, sitting beside his wife of 73 years, who her leg amputated, was in a wheelchair, and unable to communicate after a stroke. And after telling me his story and his wife's story, he looks at me, and he tells me, the Americans, my cousins, made sure that I got here. He said, and couldn't be a better life. A good wife, children, grandchildren, a home, everything good. I'm happy to take questions.
Mike, and just raise your hand. Okay. Well, over here.
Thank you so much for your lecture. Few 100,000 Jews, Eastern European, mostly Polish Jews, managed to come to Palestine, to Ishuv before the independence. What are the typical ways, trajectories they came with?
The Jews who came, there was a quota on, the British put a quota on Jews, and they tightened that quota towards the end of the war. And it became nearly impossible. A few could get in legally, but very few. Those who were able to break through the barriers and get to Haifa were quickly put on buses, taken back to the port, put on ships, and taken to Cyprus, where they remained until independence. The British, I'll stop there. I have nothing good to say about their treatment and their behavior.
So when did the camps last? When was the last camp closed?
The last camp was closed in the 50s that the Jews were in. The Orthodox Jews didn't want to go to Israel because the Messiah had not arrived yet. So they weren't going to go to Israel because they didn't believe in Israel. So they stayed behind in Germany. And it took, such diplomacy with the help of the Americans to resettle them, because they weren't going to be resettled anywhere. They had to be resettled in their own community within walking distance of their shul. That took place in the 1950s. The Jews were the last to leave. Some Jews who had gone to Israel came back to the camps because they hoped from back in the camps they would get a free pass to Canada or the United States. Some did, and they also were among the last to leave.
The last camp was 56.
56? Yeah.
And the reason it was closed is because a Christian organization bought that site for the Hungarian refugees.
Yes.
It was closed and the Jews were kicked out.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the last camp was in 56 at Fürnwald. And the way it was closed was a Christian organization bought that site for the Hungarian refugees.
Yeah.
And the Jews that stayed there did not just stay for religious reasons. Many of those were broken people
Yeah.
that didn't have the strength to go anywhere
Yeah.
and just stayed out of, lack of strength and
Yeah,
perspective.
they stayed for a lack of strength. They didn't want to go to Israel because of the perpetual turmoil in Israel. You're right.
Right.
And many, there were some Jews who had married Germans or who had relationships with Germans, and they wanted to stay. But it was a tiny proportion of the 250,000. But you're right, and I thank you for correcting that.
Also, Israel was a rough place.
Yes, absolutely.
My aunt went to Israel and couldn't make it. All she was told was, here's your factory work, and there was no support. Israel was busy with surviving. And
Israel was fighting a war at the
Right.
time. And, there are any number of stories. I tried to find, one cannot find, I couldn't, migration outwards from Israel to the United States. How many of the 155,000 could not survive? The story I tell in the book, and, I'm short-circuiting it here, many of the displaced persons were sent directly to the front lines to fight to fight in the War of Independence, 47, 48. They were sent directly to the front lines because they didn't speak Hebrew, and there was no way they could serve the army not speaking Hebrew except on the front lines. And the loss of life was terrific. I don't want to criticize the Israeli government, but the Israeli government didn't know what to do with the displaced persons who arrived, many of them in conditions that were, deplorable. They were disabled, they were disoriented, they had lived through hell.
Did a group also go to Ethiopia? Wasn't there, instead of Israel, weren't they also offered to go to Ethiopia?
No, not the displaced persons. They went every place else and I talk about it in my book. Some large numbers went to South Africa. Large numbers went to Australia. Large numbers went to Canada. Large numbers went to not large numbers. Numbers went to South America. But again, the first place to offer them refuge was Israel. It was not until the Displaced Persons Act in the United States was amended to remove the restrictions on Jews that they were able to come into the United States. And once they came into the United States, other nations began to offer asylum.
I have a question from one of the live stream viewers. I'll just cut in briefly. We got a couple questions about your research process, asking, what primary and secondary sources you used, and someone in particular wanted to know where you found all these wonderful photos that you showed us tonight.
I don't know. It's in the book. I talk about them. Some of them came from the Holocaust Museum in Washington. Some of them came from other museums and other sources. I spent a lot of time in Washington. I spent a lot of time at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. I spent a lot of time at libraries across the country. I had research assistants in Israel and in Germany who found materials for me, and there were government sources. The book is a lot about which I couldn't get into now, the machinations. I mean, the State Department files are filled with letters back and forth from Truman to Prime Minister Attlee trying to get the Jews in. The United Nations, UNRWA, UNRRA, has archives that are in New York. So there were many, many, many sources that I was able to use.
Speak a little bit about the economies of the DP camps. I know that there were black market activity, and there was, the economy in all of Germany was decimated, and so it was sort of like the only market.
Yeah, the black.
Also, I'm wondering if people saved money to come to America and how that worked.
Yeah, there were, look, the Jews were blamed as the only ones who participated in the black market, which is totally, absolutely false. In the Polish camps, the Lithuanian camps, the Latvian camps, there were black marketeers. The Jews did well, and there were some Jews who made money on the black market. The UNRWA and the American Army supplied food, but not fresh meat, not fresh vegetables. And a lot of what the black marketeers did was they took the canned goods that the Army gave them and went out and bartered them for, and more than the canned goods, cigarettes. They took the cigarettes that they got, went out and bartered them with suppliers of meat, vegetables, and brought back into the camps this material. Some made a great deal of money.
I think we have time for one last question. If anyone's feeling brave, here you go.
So, what have you found about the medical? What have you found about the medical treatment in the DP camps?
The medical treatment was decent, but most of typhus could be treated, tuberculosis could be treated, but the wear and tear on the bodies of those who had been in the camps was such that the doctors and the nurses could do very little. I mean, the Red Cross tried, and there were any number of attempts. What these people needed was peace, security, and the ability to forget and to move on. And doctors couldn't supply that. I thank you all. You've been a great audience. Thank you.
So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much, David, for that wonderful presentation and Q&A session. For those of us in person tonight, there'll be book sales and signings in our first floor lobby, so make sure to stop by. And of course, for our virtual audience, The Last Million is available wherever you buy your books, and you'll also be receiving a link where you can purchase the book in the follow-up email that you'll get tomorrow. So thank you, everyone. Have a good night.